clang of the heavy steel gate, a sound designed to reverberate through the deepest recesses of the soul, was the final punctuation mark on a decade of silence. It was a noise that severed the world of structured deprivation from the unpredictable chaos of freedom. Ellsworth Bumpy Jhonson stood momentarily on the curb of the bustling street, a man carved from granite and tailored wool, absorbing the sensory barrage of the world he had been forbidden. The air, thick and humid with the promise of a late summer storm, smelled of exhaust fumes, stale beer, and something far more insidious, a faint, unfamiliar perfume of alien efficiency and subtle, pervasive fear. He carried no baggage to speak of, only the tailored gray suit, perfectly pressed despite the years, and the deep, abiding conviction that the world owed him a debt. But as his dark eyes scanned the familiar yet jarringly different landscape of New York City, a cold, hard knot formed in his stomach. The city had metabolized his absence. 10 years is an eternity in the rapid, unforgiving ecosystem of organized crime, and Bumpy was returning not as the undisputed sovereign he had been, but as a ghost emerging from the crypt, threatening to spook those who had long since claimed the land for their own harvest. This was the mid-1960s. The Harlem Bumpy remembered, a volatile mix of defiant artistry, political awakening, and entrenched local crime run by men who knew the neighborhood codes, was subtly, dangerously altered. The vibrant, sometimes chaotic energy was still present, pulsing in the rhythm of the jazz spilling from the clandestine clubs, in the passionate rhetoric echoing from soapboxes near the corner of 125th Street. Yet, underneath the surface, where the true money changed hands and loyalty was purchased in blood and favors, the landscape had been meticulously scraped clean and repopulated by invasive species. The most noticeable difference wasn't the color of the paint on the brownstones or the model year of the automobiles. It was the lack of recognizable faces manning the crucial checkpoints. The old runners, the trusted policy bankers, the watchful sentinels who operated the delicate mechanism of the Harlem underworld, they were gone, replaced by younger, harder men who lacked the necessary veneer of local respect, men whose movements were too crisp, whose eyes held a cold, standardized calculation Bumpy associated only with large-scale corporate enterprise. This was the essence of the new conflict, the immediate, inescapable truth that hit Bumpy with the force of a physical blow. The Italian Mafia had not merely encroached upon Harlem, they had annexed it. While Bumpy was serving his time, the great families, specifically the Genovese, had executed a flawless, silent takeover, treating his incarceration not as a temporary setback for a rival power, but as the permanent abdication of a weak, localized king. The Genovese family, though nominally guided by the shrewd, distant wisdom of men like the now elder statesman Frank Costello, who preferred the quiet calculation of boardrooms and political maneuvering to the blunt brutality of street wars, had seen the vast, untapped financial potential of Harlem. Costello, even in semi-retirement, understood infrastructure and efficiency. He understood that a localized operation run by a powerful but solitary figure like Bumpy was a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. They had brought a level of organization and scale that Bumpy, for all his genius, had resisted. They didn't just deal in the numbers game, they industrialized the burgeoning heroin trade, viewing the desperate population as a guaranteed, renewable resource. They consolidated the protection rackets, running them with the sterile efficiency of a multinational corporation. The money flowing out of Harlem was no longer being recycled back into the community, nourishing the local economy. It was being funneled directly downtown, across the bridges, into the coffers of powerful families who saw the residents of Harlem not as potential partners or even rivals, but as raw economic input. Bumpy's first stop was a low-key social club in the low hundreds, a place that had survived the turnover simply because its owner was too insignificant to bother controlling, but whose walls possessed excellent acoustic memory. He sat in a shadowed booth, his gaze steady, accepting the hushed reverence of the few old faces who dared approach him. "It's different, Bumpy," whispered Omar, a former numbers runner whose knees now shook, betraying the constant state of fear under which he lived. "They came in like a tide, washing everything clean. No warning, no negotiation, just the enforcement." Bumpy didn't respond immediately. He just watched. He watched the way the younger men on the street held their posture, not the defiant slump of the true street hustler, but the rigid, nervous bearing of hired muscle, waiting for the next directive. "Who's the face, Omar? The man on the ground?" Bumpy finally asked, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a man signing a death warrant. They run it through proxies, Bumpy, clean fronts. But the muscle is Genovese. They got a new guy, answers directly to the prince, they call him. A young captain, Vinny the Whip DeLuca. He's got the temperament of a viper, and he treats every dollar made up here like it was stolen from his own mother's purse. The complexity of the Genovese takeover lay in their strategy of total systemic displacement. They hadn't merely killed off Bumpy's lieutenants, they had corrupted the foundation. They paid off precinct captains, ensuring that any local police action was focused entirely on maintaining public order, not on interfering with the profitable Italian operations. They undercut supply lines for independent operators, making it economically impossible for any black organization to compete in the heroin or high-stakes gambling markets. This revelation was the second hook, sinking deep into Bumpy's resolve. This wasn't a skirmish for territory, it was a war for sovereignty. They hadn't just taken his empire, they had tried to erase the very memory of it, attempting to establish a permanent colonial structure of crime where the profit always flowed outward. Over the next 72 hours, Bumpy moved with the deliberate pace of a chess master, analyzing a deeply complex opening. He visited old associates, many of whom were too terrified to offer more than vague platitudes, and others who had, shamefully, bent the knee to the new masters to save their own lives or businesses. He walked the streets, using his eyes and his instincts, reconstructing the puzzle piece by piece. He learned that DeLuca operated primarily from an inconspicuous distribution hub near the river, utilizing the docks and old warehouse infrastructure the Genovese were masters at exploiting. The key to their local success was the policy racket, the numbers game. This was the traditional heart of Harlem's underworld economy, deeply ingrained in the culture. When Bumpy ran the numbers, it was a system of localized trust and debt. The Genovese had formalized it, digitized it, using runners who didn't even know the names of the people collecting the money, merely coded deposit drops, ensuring that the personal loyalty that Bumpy cultivated was systematically eliminated. The open loops were tantalizingly simple. How could Bumpy, now isolated and stripped of his ready resources, dismantle an industrialized operation backed by the wealth and political influence of the largest crime family in America? And how could he signal his return in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as a sporadic act of violence, but as a formal declaration of war? The development phase began with a pattern interrupt. Bumpy knew the Genovese would be expecting him to go after the money or the drugs immediately. He chose instead to strike at the symbol of their arrogance. One evening, Bumpy located one of the primary enforcers, a hulking Italian named Frankie the Hammer, who had recently taken over the protection racket for a small chain of barbershops and restaurants on Lenox Avenue, places that had once paid tribute directly to Bumpy's organization. Frankie, conspicuous in his tailored double-breasted suit and diamond pinky ring, was holding court in a previously black-owned jazz club, now serving cheap, watered-down liquor under the new management. Bumpy didn't arrive with a phalanx of gunmen. He walked in alone, the picture of quiet dignity, his presence immediately sucking the air out of the room. The music stuttered to a halt. Frankie recognized him instantly, the legend made flesh, and a nervous, dismissive sneer spread across his face. "Well, look what the prison bus dragged in. Thought you were enjoying your government retirement, Bumpy?" Bumpy approached the table slowly, deliberately, his movements fluid and coiled. He picked up the shot glass of cheap whiskey Frankie was holding, sniffed it once, and set it down with clinical precision. "You're sitting in my house, Frankie," Bumpy stated, his voice barely rising above a conversational level, yet it cut through the silence like broken glass. "You're drinking my profit, and you're insulting my name." This was the re-engagement. The second hook meant to grab the attention not just of the room, but of the entire Genovese structure operating north of 110th Street. Bumpy had to force their hand, demanding their immediate attention. Frankie laughed, a harsh, grating sound meant to convey confidence he clearly didn't possess. He reached slowly toward the small automatic weapon tucked beneath his waistband, a subtle move he believed was hidden by the tablecloth. But Bumpy was already moving. He was faster than a man his age, or a man just released from years of confinement, had any right to be. The attack wasn't blunt force, it was surgical. With a speed honed in countless back-alley encounters and prison fights, Bumpy seized Frankie's wrist, twisting it sharply, disabling the hand, before driving a sharp elbow into the bridge of Frankie's nose. The sickening crunch echoed in the stunned room. Frankie crumpled, roaring in pain, blood pouring down his expensive silk shirt. Bumpy leaned down, his face inches from the whimpering man's ear, delivering the climax of this initial strike. "Tell DeLuca, Bumpy whispered, his breath hot and dangerous, "that the rent is due, and that I prefer my payment in flesh, not currency." Bumpy didn't take the gun. He didn't rob the register. He simply turned and walked out, leaving the stunned patrons and the bleeding enforcer as his messengers. This act was not about eliminating a threat. It was about planting a seed of absolute terror and declaring the terms of the engagement. The great revelation for the Genovese was that Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, had not atrophied in prison. He had hardened. He was returning not to reclaim a lost empire, but to annihilate the usurpers. The structure of the Genovese operation, the cold, impersonal efficiency that relied on minimizing direct conflict, was now exposed as a weakness against a man who thrived on personal, existential warfare. The payoff was immediate. Within hours, Bumpy received a cryptic message relayed through an old, terrified intermediary. DeLuca knew. DeLuca was ready. The war had officially begun. The Harlem streets, long under the shadow of the Italian threat, were about to become a chaotic battlefield defined by the collision of corporate ambition and personal vengeance. The next moves would require strategy, alliances, and a level of calculated, shocking violence Bumpy hadn't employed in years. His network was decimated, his resources low, but his resolve was absolute. He had faced down judges, wardens, and poverty. Now he faced the entire consolidated might of the Italian Mafia, determined to prove that Harlem belonged to its people, or at least, to the black man who had mastered its shadows. The initial shot had been fired. The consequences would be devastating. This narrative is far from over. Join us for Part 2, where Bumpy Johnson executes his counteroffensive, initiating a bloody, devastating war against Vinnie DeLuca and the overwhelming power of the Genovese crime family. The air in Harlem did not simply thicken, it curdled, spoiled by the metallic tang of fear and the unspoken promise of immediate violence. This was not the territory of turf squabbles anymore. It was ground zero in a war of cultures, a collision between established continental arrogance and the tenacious, deeply rooted defiance of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The Genovese family, having suffered embarrassing, yet ultimately minor initial setbacks, had abandoned subtlety entirely. Their response to Bumpy's resilience was a tidal wave of pressure designed to crush the man not just physically, but financially and psychologically. Every corner was watched, every delivery delayed, every policy runner intercepted with a brutal, silent efficiency that spoke volumes about the resources now being dedicated to this single, disruptive operation. Frank Costello, though nominally stepping back, still commanded the strategic movements, viewing Bumpy not as a mere rival, but as an infection that, if unchecked, would signal weakness to every aspiring street boss in the city, especially those who felt marginalized by the rigid Italian structure. They were deploying professional hitters now, men whose faces were unknown in Harlem, ghosts imported from Brooklyn and New Jersey, tasked with making Bumpy's life a perpetual, terrifying chess game. Bumpy, retreating into the dimly lit, smoke-hazed back rooms that served as his tactical bunkers, understood the profound shift in the game. He was no longer fighting for control of the heroin routes or the policy pools. He was fighting for the right to breathe, for the very integrity of the community that depended on his protection, however flawed. The tension coiled in his gut was a physical anchor, heavy and cold. He was surrounded by loyalists, but loyalty in the face of machine gun fire was a finite resource. The crucial question that burned beneath the surface of every strategy session was, how do you fight an enemy that can afford to lose 10 men for every one you lose and still not flinch? The Genovese operation was less an army and more a vast hydrological system. Cutting off one tributary only meant the pressure built elsewhere. The immediate crisis lay in the supply lines. The Italians had begun strategically choking the flow of necessary goods, not just drugs, but the mundane items Bumpy needed to maintain his network. Paper for the number slips, liquor for the legitimate fronts, and, most critically, the steady flow of cash from the policy banks that kept Harlem's economy lubricated. They weren't just stealing, they were paralyzing the machine. Bumpy felt the chill of isolation creeping in. The politicians he had once quietly subsidized were answering phone calls with strained voices, and the police patrols were suddenly, miraculously, omnipresent near his key stash houses, yet blind when Genovese thugs drove through the neighborhood. This systemic chokehold forced Bumpy into an audacious, almost suicidal gamble. He had to strike at the heart of the beast, far from the familiar congested streets of Harlem, where the Genovese felt impregnable. His intelligence network, painstakingly reconstructed since his release, pointed to a major financial consolidation point. Not a back alley safe, but a seemingly legitimate import-export firm on the Lower East Side, acting as a crucial clearinghouse for Costello's immense, untraceable policy and narcotics revenue, a place where hundreds of thousands of dollars transitioned from street receipts into laundered capital weekly. This was the vulnerable neck of the hydrological system. Bumpy knew his strength lay in surprise, precision, and the intimate knowledge of the city's shadows that the arrogant Italians, stuck in their traditional hierarchies, consistently underestimated in a black strategist. He planned a pattern interruptus, so severe it would send shivers up the spine of the entire 5 families, a move that would prove Harlem was not a territory to be annexed, but a landmine to be avoided. The development phase involved weeks of agonizing, clandestine preparation. Bumpy's crew was small but sharp, composed of veterans who had served time alongside him and young, desperate men fueled by righteous fury against the encroachment. They weren't trained for pitched battles. They were trained for surgical strikes. The plan involved exploiting an old, forgotten municipal tunnel system beneath the Lower East Side, utilizing techniques Bumpy had perfected during his early days running contraband during Prohibition. A dark art of urban infiltration the new generation of Mafia bosses had long dismissed as primitive. The tension escalated daily. A close associate, a respected policy runner named Zeke, was found brutalized, his death a public theatrical warning left squarely in the middle of Lenox Avenue. This was the Genovese attempt to break Bumpy's spirit, a blatant declaration that the rules of engagement had dissolved into simple, sadistic messaging. Bumpy, viewing Zeke's fate, felt the cool logic of strategy temporarily dissolve, replaced by a searing, necessary rage. This sacrifice demanded a proportional, unforgettable retaliation. The night of the strike was cloaked in the humid, oppressive stillness that often precedes a summer storm in Manhattan. Bumpy, dressed not in his signature fine suit but in dark, worn utility clothing, a ghost of his younger, hungrier self, led the small contingent. They moved through the subterranean passages, the air heavy with the smell of mold and stagnant water, inching closer to the target facility. This was the re-engagement point, a reminder that Bumpy Jhonson, the mastermind, was also a predator, perfectly capable of navigating the dark underbelly of the city while his enemies toasted their presumed success in brightly lit restaurants uptown. The target building was nondescript, guarded by 2 bulky men who looked bored and complacent, confident in the anonymity of the location. Inside, the money room was a fortress of filing cabinets and heavy safes, the week's take meticulously counted and secured, awaiting collection by the high-level couriers. The plan unfolded with terrifying efficiency. Instead of a frontal assault, Bumpy's men utilized specialized charges, stolen from a corrupt demolition contractor, to breach the underground vault from below, exploiting a crucial architectural blind spot in the building's century-old foundation. The resulting explosion was muffled by the thick earth and the surrounding structures, sounding to the street guards like a distant, heavy truck backfiring. The subsequent chaos inside was deliberate and precise. They didn't linger to fight the surprised internal security. Bumpy was not interested in corpses. He was interested in cash and, more importantly, proof. They bypassed the easily recoverable bills, instead focusing on the meticulous ledgers, the detailed records outlining the payoff structure, the political conduits, and the exact volume of illicit funds handled by the Genovese front. They didn't empty the vault, they salted the earth. They doused the remaining, easily traceable cash, tens of thousands, with indelible red dye, rigging the remaining contents to explode harmlessly minutes later, creating a scene of absolute, spectacular ruin that would be undeniable to any authority called to the scene. Bumpy, retrieving the single satchel containing the critical ledgers and a handful of untraceable bonds, left the building seconds before the secondary charges detonated. The resulting flash and the immediate scent of burning paper mingling with the heavy industrial air signaled the climax of the struggle. When the Genovese organization discovered the desecration hours later, not just the theft, but the symbolic destruction of their untouchable financial hub, the irreversible staining of their capital, and the loss of their crucial accounting records, the shock was seismic. This wasn't a robbery, it was a decapitation. The operation proved Bumpy possessed 2 critical and terrifying advantages: the ability to vanish into thin air and undeniable leverage. The ledgers Bumpy secured were not just evidence of petty crimes. They detailed the complex web of political corruption connecting Costello's operations to high-ranking city officials, judges, and even elements within the federal system. These documents, once disseminated through carefully chosen, anonymous intermediaries, a highly placed journalist known for his incorruptibility and a savvy, antagonistic prosecutor, became the definitive bargaining chip. Bumpy did not use the ledgers to eliminate the Genovese family. That would invite immediate, complete obliteration from the remaining families and the full force of federal law enforcement. He used them for surgical, strategic retreat. The silent, definitive conclusion came not in a hail of bullets, but in a series of highly tense, secretive meetings arranged through old-world intermediaries who understood the language of necessity and mutual preservation. The message Bumpy delivered was unequivocal. He did not want Manhattan, he did not want Brooklyn, but Harlem was his. If the Genovese continued their campaign of annexation, the ledgers would be fully released, sinking not just Costello's interests, but dragging countless powerful high society figures into the mud, ensuring decades of destructive investigations that would paralyze the entire Cosa Nostra structure in New York. The Genovese, facing internal dissent and the terrifying specter of federal intervention fueled by their own compromised books, made the only rational choice. They withdrew. The agreement was a cold, brutal peace. Harlem became designated as poison territory, a zone of non-engagement for the Italian syndicates. Bumpy had secured not just survival, but absolute, albeit fragile, autonomy. He had stared down the Leviathan of the Mafia and forced it to retreat simply by demonstrating that the cost of conquering his streets was far greater than the profit derived from them. The immediate aftermath saw a slow, deliberate return to a semblance of normal chaos. The imported muscle vanished overnight. The atmosphere of terror lifted, replaced by a profound, grudging respect for the man who refused to bend. Bumpy Johnson stood not as a triumphant conqueror, but as a deeply weary survivor. The conflict had cost him deeply, staining his reputation further, isolating him from the few legitimate avenues he had cultivated, and cementing his status as a permanent outlaw, a necessary, terrifying figure who had secured Harlem's independence through violence and unmatched strategic brilliance. He had won the war, but the peace was merely the uneasy silence before the next, inevitable storm. His power was absolute within his domain, yet forever shadowed by the immense power he had only temporarily pushed back. The struggle for ownership was over. The eternal struggle for maintenance had just begun. This pivotal war cemented the legend. The man who walked out of prison into an ambush and, instead of fleeing, taught the most powerful criminal organization in America that some ground is simply not worth the blood required to hold it. He had done what no other independent operator dared, carving out a space for himself and his community against overwhelming odds, paying the ultimate price in lost innocence and perpetual vigilance. The question remains, how does one reconcile the brutality required to achieve such freedom with the moral cost of wielding that power? How long can such a precarious autonomy last when the giant is merely nursing its wounds? If you were gripped by the sheer audacity and deadly intelligence required for Bumpy Johnson to not only survive, but force the mighty Genovese family to recognize his sovereignty over Harlem, then you must delve deeper into the intricate web of strategy and survival that defined his life. Discover the specific political fallout of those ledgers and the long-term consequences of this impossible victory. Share this story and explore the next chapter in the life of the King of Harlem.